Today is May 12, 2026, and something is happening 90 miles off the coast of Florida that the Iran coverage, the Hormuz blockade, and the diplomatic chess match with Tehran have been crowding off the front page. But it deserves the same level of analytical attention that the Persian Gulf situation is receiving because the pattern emerging around Cuba right now is not new. It is a pattern that every analyst who watched what happened in Venezuela over the past several months has seen before. And the last time this specific pattern appeared, it ended with Delta Force and the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment going in and pulling Maduro out. The United States military is running the same playbook around Cuba that it ran around Venezuela, surveillance aircraft surging to levels that were exceedingly rare before. February, spy planes mapping every inch of the island's defensive architecture, drones collecting signals intelligence at distances that put every Cuban military installation within sensor range. Trump publicly expressing frustration that months of sustained economic pressure have not produced the collapse he expected, and an administration that has already demonstrated in Venezuela that frustration plus a refusal to capitulate equals military action. Cuba's communist government is watching all of this and calling it dangerous. What it actually is a sequence that has a documented endpoint. And understanding where that endpoint leads requires understanding exactly what the United States has assembled around the island over the past several months and why the timing of its appearance tells you more than anything Cuban or American officials have said publicly. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why the surveillance surge around Cuba right now is the most important underreported story in American foreign policy, you need to understand what happened in Venezuela and why that sequence is the template being applied 90 miles south of Key West today. Here is where things stand as of May 12, 2026. Since February 4th of this year, the U.S. Navy and Air Force have conducted at least 25 intelligence-gathering flights off the coast of Cuba, using a combination of manned aircraft and unmanned surveillance drones. These are not routine patrol flights. These are not incidental transits by aircraft completing other missions. A CNN analysis of publicly available aviation data confirmed the surge, its specificity, its concentration around Cuba's two largest population and military centers, Havana and Santiago de Cuba, and the proximity of those flights to the Cuban coastline. Some of these missions came within 40 miles of the coast, placing them well inside the optimal collection range for the sensor packages these aircraft carry. Before February, publicly visible flights of this type and frequency in this area were exceedingly rare. The sudden appearance of this surveillance architecture around Cuba at this density, concentrated on these specific geographic targets, immediately after the Venezuela operation concluded, is not a coincidence. It is an operational posture and operational postures of this specific type in the current administration's foreign policy. Pattern have a next step that Venezuela already demonstrated. Now let's get into what the aircraft actually are, because the specific platforms being deployed around Cuba tell you more about the operation's purpose than any public statement. The primary aircraft identified in the surveillance surge is the P-8 Poseidon. This is a highly sophisticated maritime surveillance platform, a modified Boeing 737 airframe carrying sensors specifically designed to collect signals intelligence, track submarine activity, and build a comprehensive picture of the electronic and communications environment in its operating area. The P-8 does not just photograph what is below it. It soaks up every electronic emission in its collection envelope, every radar activation, every military radio transmission, every communications signal that passes through the electromagnetic spectrum in its range, and processes that information into an intelligence picture that can be transmitted in real time to commands that need it. Flying a P-8 at the distances and frequencies being reported around Cuba is not surveillance. It is the construction of a complete electronic order of battle for every Cuban military installation, radar system, communications network, and defensive system that emits a detectable signal. That picture, built over weeks of repeated flights, becomes the targeting architecture for whatever comes next, the RC-135 Rivet Joint. Flights are the detail that makes the picture most serious. The Rivet Joint is an even more specialized signals intelligence platform. It carries crews of electronic warfare officers and intelligence specialists whose job is not just to collect signals but to analyze them in real time during the flight, building specific profiles of radar frequencies, missile guidance systems, communications encryption patterns, and military command networks that cannot be reconstructed from raw collected data alone. You do not fly RC-135 Rivet Joints at this frequency around an island 90 miles from your coastline because you are conducting routine monitoring. You fly them because you are building a specific operational picture that your planners need before they can finalize a specific operational plan, and the MQ-4 Triton high-altitude reconnaissance drones complete the collection architecture by providing persistent overhead coverage that fills the gaps between manned aircraft sorties, ensuring continuous surveillance of the target area across timeframes that no crewed aircraft can maintain without rotating through multiple airframes and crews. Read what that combination of platforms means when they are all operating simultaneously around the same geographic target. The P-8 builds the signals intelligence picture. The RC-135 Rivet Joint refines the electronic order of battle with specialist analysis. The MQ-4 Triton provides the persistent overhead coverage that fills the temporal gaps. Together, they are producing the complete intelligence architecture that military planners need before any significant operation, not after the decision to act before it. Because the intelligence collection that these platforms conduct is what enables the decision-making, not what follows it. The fact that this architecture is already operating around Cuba at this density and frequency tells you that the decision-making process has already reached the stage that requires this kind of intelligence support. That is not a future possibility. That is the current operational status. Now let's talk about Trump's frustration, because this is the detail that the NBC News reporting surfaced and that deserves more analytical weight than it has received. President Trump has grown increasingly frustrated with the Cuban government's ability to maintain power despite months of sustained US pressure. He has been pressing his advisors about why the administration's efforts to tip the regime into collapse have not yet succeeded. Read those two sentences together and understand what they describe. A president who applied maximum economic pressure to Venezuela, watched Maduro refuse to capitulate, grew frustrated with that refusal, and then authorized the military operation that removed the problem. Now applying the same maximum economic pressure to Cuba, watching Cuba's communist government refuse to bend, growing frustrated with that refusal, and pressing his advisors about why the strategy is not producing the collapse he expected. The analytical parallel is not subtle, it is direct, and the last time this specific sequence, pressure plus refusal plus frustration, played out, the outcome was a military operation. That does not mean a military operation against Cuba is certain or imminent. It means the conditions that produced military action in Venezuela are being reproduced around Cuba with a fidelity that anyone who watched Venezuela develop cannot look at without recognizing the template. Cuba's government has responded to the surveillance surge and the mounting pressure with a combination of condemnation and defiance. That tracks exactly with how every cornered authoritarian government responds to this kind of external pressure. Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez characterized US statements as hinting at military action to liberate Cuba. He called those hints dangerous and an international crime. He cited decades of American sanctions as the root cause of Cuba's economic and social problems. He said the U.S. posture was hypocritical and cynical. The Cuban government's official media is broadcasting narratives of resistance and sovereignty violation. That is the communication package of a government that has decided public defiance is its best available option, not because defiance is strategically sound, but because capitulation is politically impossible for a leadership that has built its entire legitimacy on resistance to American pressure across 6 decades. Cuba's communist government cannot negotiate a surrender, it can only resist or collapse. And the United States, having watched that binary play out in Caracas and produced the outcome it preferred, is now constructing the same pressure environment 90 miles south of Florida with a speed and a specificity that suggests the timeline for Cuba's binary is not measured in years. Now let's get into the economic picture, because the financial pressure being applied to Cuba is the dimension of this situation that is moving fastest and producing the most visible domestic consequences for the Cuban population. Cuba's tourism industry, the primary source of foreign exchange revenue for a government that has no significant oil exports and whose agricultural sector has been in managed decline for decades, has collapsed by nearly 50% in early 2026 compared to equivalent periods in the previous year. That is not a modest downturn. That is a structural revenue collapse happening against the backdrop of what the rest of the Caribbean is experiencing simultaneously. While Cuba's tourism numbers are cratering, the rest of the Caribbean is enjoying what industry analysts are calling a historic tourism boom. The same travelers, the same disposable income, the same demand for Caribbean destinations is flowing into every market except Cuba, where the combination of American sanctions, the oil blockade restricting fuel shipments, the resulting island-wide power blackouts, and the general deterioration of basic services has made the destination proposition unviable for the international tourist market. The irony of a Caribbean island watching its neighbors thrive in a historic tourism boom while its own tourism sector collapses by 50% is not lost on the Cuban population living through both the economic contraction and the energy crisis simultaneously. The island-wide blackouts deserve specific attention because they represent the most visceral and inescapable expression of the economic pressure for ordinary Cubans in a way that no statistic can fully capture. Cuba relies heavily on fuel imports to power the electrical generation infrastructure that keeps its cities functioning. The U.S. oil blockade has vastly restricted those fuel shipments. When the fuel that runs the generators stops arriving in sufficient quantities, the generators stop running. When the generators stop running, the grid fails. When the grid fails, the blackouts spread from the capital to the provinces. Food spoils in refrigerators that have no power. Hospitals run on backup systems that were not designed for extended continuous operation, businesses that depend on electricity cannot operate, and the population that was already living with the chronic shortages and economic dysfunction of 6 decades of communist mismanagement now experiences the acute emergency of living without reliable power in a tropical climate where heat without air conditioning or refrigeration is not an inconvenience but a health threat. The blackouts are the blockade made physical and inescapable for every Cuban who cannot avoid noticing that the lights are off again in a country that has been promising electricity security for as long as anyone can remember. Now let's talk about GISA, because this is the financial architecture that Marco Rubio specifically targeted with the most recent sanctions package, and that tells you more about how the Cuban Communist government actually functions economically than any official description of Cuba's governance would. GISA is a holding company established by Cuban military generals. It operates as a parallel economic structure that sits alongside the official Cuban government budget and captures a significant proportion of the economic activity that generates revenue on the island: tourism receipts, import revenues, certain export proceeds, commercial activity in multiple sectors, all flowing into a company that, in Rubio's description, has more money than the government itself. None of that revenue reaches the Cuban people in any form. Not a single road built, not a single bridge maintained, not a grain of rice distributed. The money flows from economic activity conducted on Cuban territory by Cuban workers into the pockets of the military generals who established the company and the regime insiders who benefit from its distributions. This is not a secondary feature of the Cuban economic system. It is the primary mechanism through which the military elite that runs Cuba captures the economic surplus generated by the population it governs, while maintaining the fiction that Cuba's poverty is the result of American sanctions rather than the result of a system designed to extract resources from the population and concentrate them in the hands of the people running the system. Rubio's sanctions targeting GISA are not sanctions on the Cuban people. They are sanctions on the mechanism the Cuban military uses to steal from the Cuban people at scale, and the announcement that more sanctions are coming is the financial track of the same three-track pressure strategy that has been applied to Venezuela, to Iran, and now to Cuba simultaneously. Let me walk you through what the Russian, Chinese, and Iranian presence in Cuba means for the strategic calculation Washington is making about the island, because this is the dimension of the Cuba situation that elevates it from a bilateral dispute about communism and democracy into a direct American national security concern that the administration's framing around Venezuela and Iran does not fully capture in isolation. Cuba is 90 miles from the Florida coast. That geographic fact, which has defined American strategic anxiety about the island since the 1959 revolution and produced the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, is the foundational reason every American administration treats Cuba differently from other authoritarian governments in the Western Hemisphere. But the current concern goes beyond the traditional bilateral framing. According to the Treasury and State Department sanctions announcement, Cuba has been auctioned off as a platform for foreign intelligence, military, and terror operations by actors whose relationship with the United States is defined by active adversarial competition: Russians, Chinese, Iranians. The same actors whose activities in other theaters are defining the most consequential geopolitical confrontations of the current moment are establishing intelligence and military operational infrastructure on an island 90 miles from American territory. That is not a theoretical concern, it is the specific justification cited in the sanctions package. And it reframes the Cuba situation from a question about the sustainability of a communist government into a question about whether the United States will tolerate a forward operating base for its primary strategic adversaries 90 miles from its coastline indefinitely, the answer that the Venezuela operation provided to the analogous question about Maduro's utility to those adversaries is the data point that every analyst of the Cuba situation should be factoring into their assessment. Now let's talk about the Venezuela template in the specific detail it deserves, because the parallel between what preceded the Venezuela operation and what is currently happening around Cuba is precise enough that laying the two sequences side by side produces an analytical picture that neither side of the current debate about Cuba policy can comfortably ignore. In Venezuela, the pattern unfolded in a specific sequence. Maximum economic pressure was applied through sanctions targeting the Maduro government's revenue streams and the personal finances of regime insiders. Intelligence collection around Venezuelan military installations and communications infrastructure intensified using the same platform types now deployed around Cuba. Trump expressed public frustration that the economic pressure was not producing the political collapse the administration expected. The Venezuelan government publicly condemned the American pressure as illegal and dangerous while privately failing to find any exit from the economic deterioration it was experiencing, and then the operation launched Delta Force, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. A targeted extraction that removed the specific individual whose continued presence was preventing the political transition the administration wanted to see. The operation was precise, limited, and successful in achieving its stated objective. Now map that sequence onto what is visible around Cuba today, maximum economic pressure being applied through sanctions targeting Gaisa and the regime's revenue streams. Tourism collapsed by 50%, oil blockade restricting fuel shipments and producing island-wide blackouts. Intelligence collection surging around Cuban military installations and urban centers using P-8 Poseidons, RC-135 Rivet Joints, and MQ-4 Triton drones at frequencies that were exceedingly rare before February. Trump expressing frustration that months of pressure have not produced the collapse he expected. Cuba's government publicly condemning the American pressure as dangerous and illegal while failing to find any exit from the economic deterioration the blockade is producing. The sequence is not analogous. It is identical. The only variable that has not yet matched the Venezuela template is the operation itself. And the intelligence collection architecture being assembled around Cuba right now is specifically the phase of the Venezuela template that immediately preceded that operation. Now let's get into the specific capabilities the surveillance aircraft are building into the operational picture, because understanding what information the P-8 Poseidon and the RC-135 Rivet Joint and the MQ-4 Triton are actually collecting around Cuba is understanding what a future operation would know before it launched. The P-8 Poseidon signals intelligence capability allows it to collect every electromagnetic emission in its operating area, map the location and frequency parameters of Cuban radar systems, identify the communications patterns of Cuban military command networks, track the electronic signatures of Cuban naval assets, and build a complete picture of the electromagnetic environment that any operating force would need to navigate to reach its objectives without triggering defensive responses from systems that were not yet suppressed. At 40 miles from the Cuban coastline, the P-8 is well within collection range of Havana's military installations, the command and communications infrastructure around the capital, and the radar coverage that the Cuban Air Defense Force maintains over the island's most critical areas. 25 flights since February, concentrated on Havana and Santiago de Cuba, is not building a picture. It is refining a picture that is already substantially complete and filling in the gaps that earlier collection left. The RC-135 Rivet Joint missions are the refinement phase. The specialist crews aboard these aircraft are not collecting raw signals for later analysis. They are analyzing in real time, building specific profiles of Cuban military radar frequencies that would need to be suppressed or spoofed in any air operation, identifying the encryption patterns used in Cuban military communications networks, and mapping the specific signatures of command and control systems that would need to be targeted or isolated for any ground operation to execute without coordinated military interference. When this level of collection has been completed to the satisfaction of the planners who commissioned it, the operational phase has the intelligence architecture it needs. And the MQ-4 Triton drones provide the persistent coverage that ensures that architecture stays current up to the moment an operation would require it, because military dispositions change and intelligence pictures that are weeks old may not reflect the current location of assets that have moved in the interim. The operational picture being built around Cuba is not general surveillance, it is specific targeting architecture, and targeting architecture is built for a specific purpose. Now let me give you the strategic framework that explains why the administration is applying this pressure to Cuba simultaneously with everything happening in Iran, Venezuela, and the broader foreign policy landscape. The America First doctrine, as applied in the current administration's foreign policy execution, has a specific geographic priority hierarchy that starts with the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela was the demonstration case. The removal of Maduro proved that the administration will apply maximum pressure and follow through with military action when authoritarian governments in the Western Hemisphere refuse to capitulate under economic coercion. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. It is the most geographically proximate authoritarian government to American territory in the hemisphere. It is hosting intelligence and military operations by Russia, China, and Iran. It is producing waves of migrants that reach American shores. And its continued existence as an adversarial state aligned with America's primary strategic competitors represents a forward positioning of those competitors that no American administration focused on national security can indefinitely tolerate. The administration that went into Venezuela is not going to look at Cuba and decide the Venezuela template does not apply because the island is smaller or the government is communist rather than authoritarian populist. The template applies because the conditions that triggered its application in Venezuela are present in Cuba. The surveillance surge is the evidence that the template's triggering conditions have been assessed, acknowledged, and acted upon in the preliminary phase that intelligence collection represents. Now let's get into the three tracks of pressure that are converging on Cuba simultaneously, because just as the Iran situation involves financial, military, and psychological pressure operating in parallel, the Cuba situation has the same three-track architecture operating at different intensities. The financial track is the most advanced, Gaisa sanctioned. Additional sanctions announced as coming. The oil blockade restricting fuel shipments and producing blackouts, tourism collapsed by 50% against a backdrop of Caribbean-wide boom conditions that makes the Cuban collapse more visible and more politically damaging to the government that was supposed to deliver economic improvement. The Cuban government's financial position was already one of the most constrained of any government in the Western Hemisphere before the current pressure intensified. The removal of the revenue streams that were sustaining the regime's basic functions is not producing immediate collapse, but it is producing the accelerating deterioration that Trump is frustrated is not moving fast enough. The military track is in the intelligence preparation phase, which in the Venezuela template was the phase immediately before the operational phase. 25 surveillance flights, P-8 Poseidons, RC-135 Rivet Joints, MQ-4 Triton drones, 40-mile coastal proximity. The targeting architecture is being assembled. What the assembly is targeting is not yet confirmed in any public source, but the Venezuela template suggests the targeting is specific and personal rather than broad and infrastructural. Delta Force does not need 25 P-8 Poseidon flights to destroy a building. It needs them to understand the communications and movement patterns of specific individuals whose location and security arrangements need to be mapped before a precision extraction can be planned and executed. The psychological track is the least developed of the three in the Cuba context, but it is operating. Rubio's public statements characterizing Cuba as a platform for foreign intelligence and military operations by America's adversaries, the sanctions announcement and the public commitment to more sanctions coming, Trump's public expressions of frustration that the pressure has not yet succeeded, all of these are communications directed simultaneously at the Cuban government, at the Cuban population, and at the international audience watching whether the Venezuela template will be applied again. Here is the honest assessment of where the Cuba situation actually stands on May 12, 2026, and it requires saying clearly what the available evidence suggests without overstating the certainty that no public source can currently provide. The intelligence collection architecture being assembled around Cuba is at a level of intensity and specificity that has one documented precedent in the current administration's foreign policy execution, and that precedent ended with an operation. The financial pressure being applied is producing real and worsening economic consequences for the Cuban population and for the government's ability to fund its basic functions, but it is not producing the rapid political collapse that the administration expected. Trump's frustration with the pace of that pressure's effect is documented by NBC News reporting and is the same frustration that preceded the Venezuela decision. Cuba's government is not showing any sign of the internal fracture or capitulation that would offer an alternative to the binary the administration has set up, and the Venezuela binary, maintain power and face escalating pressure that eventually includes military action or capitulate and face whatever follows capitulation, does not have a third option for governments that the administration has identified as intolerable. Cuba has not found a third option. Venezuela did not find a third option. The surveillance flights are the operational acknowledgement that the administration has assessed whether a third option exists and determined the collection architecture it needs if the binary resolves toward military action. The structural uncertainty in this assessment is real and it matters. Cuba is not Venezuela in every dimension. The island's geography, its proximity to American territory, the potential for refugee flows, the presence of Russian and Chinese military and intelligence infrastructure that complicates any operations escalation management, and the diplomatic complexity of military action against a Caribbean island that has been the subject of American foreign policy debate for 6 decades all represent factors that the Venezuela template did not have to manage at the same scale. An operation in Cuba is not a replication of the Venezuela operation in a different location. It is a more complex problem in a more sensitive geography with more significant escalation risks from the third-party presence of actors whose response to American military action 90 miles from Florida cannot be predicted with the confidence that military planners require. That complexity may be the factor that extends the timeline between the intelligence preparation phase and whatever follows it. It may not. The Venezuela operation happened faster than most analysts expected it to, once the conditions for it were in place. The conditions around Cuba are assembling faster than the public conversation about Cuba policy has registered. And the gap between the pace of the operational preparation and the pace of the public analytical awareness of what that preparation represents is exactly the kind of gap that produces surprise when the next phase arrives. Now let's talk about what comes next, because the question every serious analyst of this situation needs to be positioned to answer is not whether the pressure on Cuba is real. It is not whether the surveillance architecture is building something specific. It is. The question is what the trigger for the next phase looks like and what the next phase looks like when it arrives. In Venezuela, the trigger was Trump's personal frustration with the pace of Maduro's capitulation reaching the threshold that authorized the operation. The NBC News reporting that Trump has been pressing advisors about why Cuba has not yet collapsed under his administration's pressure suggests that frustration threshold is being approached. The question of how close it is to being crossed is the question that no public source currently answers with the precision that would allow a confident timeline assessment. What the intelligence preparation phase tells you is that the decision-making process has reached the stage at which that threshold's crossing would find the operational architecture ready to execute. That is not the same as saying the threshold has been crossed. It is saying the planners are ready for when it is. And in foreign policy contexts where the administration has demonstrated its willingness to follow through on military action when economic pressure fails to produce its intended result, the readiness of the operational architecture is the most honest leading indicator available of the probability that the threshold will eventually be crossed. Cuba's communist government is watching the P-8 Poseidons fly 40 miles off its coast and calling the flights dangerous. What it is calling dangerous is actually a very specific kind of dangerous, the kind that has a documented outcome in Caracas, and the kind that 90 miles of open water between the Florida Keys and Havana does not make any less applicable to the island currently being mapped by the most sophisticated signals intelligence collection architecture the United States military operates. The Russian and Chinese and Iranian presence in Cuba is the wild card that every assessment of this situation has to account for and that none of them can resolve with confidence based on publicly available information. If the administration has concluded that those presences represent an active and growing threat to American national security that cannot be tolerated indefinitely, the Venezuela template's timeline may be compressed relative to what a pure Cuba bilateral analysis would suggest. If the administration has concluded that the risk of Russian or Chinese escalatory response to military action in Cuba exceeds the benefit of removing the communist government in the near term, the timeline may extend significantly. What the surveillance flights tell you is that the administration is collecting the information it needs to make that assessment with specificity. The collection is happening, the assessment is being conducted. And the outcome of that assessment is the variable that determines whether what is being assembled around Cuba in the surveillance data of May 2026 becomes the prelude to something that redefines this hemisphere's political landscape, or whether it becomes the intelligence preparation for a pressure campaign that achieves its objectives through economic and covert means before the military phase becomes necessary. Both are possible, neither is certain. And the 100% certain thing, the thing that no analysis of publicly available data can contradict, is that something is being prepared around Cuba right now that was not being prepared 6 months ago, and that looks exactly like what was being prepared around Venezuela in the months before Delta Force and the 160th flew the mission that ended that government's relevance. The surveillance flights are the evidence, the pattern is the template. And the question of when the pattern completes itself is the only variable the available evidence cannot resolve. Watch the flights, watch Rubio's sanctions announcements, watch Trump's public statements about the pace of pressure producing results, and watch whether the gap between the intelligence preparation phase and the operational phase closes on a timeline that the Venezuela precedent suggests is possible faster than the public conversation about Cuba has registered. The lights are going out on the island, the tourist flights are going elsewhere. The surveillance drones are mapping everything, and 90 miles north, the operational architects who planned what happened in Caracas have a template that worked once and a president who is frustrated that it has not yet worked a second time.